Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I'm Councillor Stuart Rawlings. I'm the Vice Chair of this committee. Unfortunately, this evening, the Chair is unable to make it, so I'll be chairing the meeting as it progresses. Can I start the agenda with item 1, declaration of interest? Sorry, apologies for absence.
Chair, the apologies that we've received thus far, as you've indicated, Councillor Rowley is unable to attend. We also have Councillor Fisher, Councillor Baker and Councillor Chambers who have expressed their apologies as well.
Thank you for that. Could you just confirm as monitoring officer, therefore, that we are quorate this evening?
Yes, we are this evening. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. So I shall move on to declarations of interest. Could anybody declare any interest they have in the agenda this evening that is not already recorded on their declaration of interest, please? There's nothing being noted. And I'll take the opportunity just to remind members that during the conversation, if you ever get into a position where you feel uncomfortable, please indicate to myself. I'm quite happy to take a declaration at that point if required. Few admin's pieces next. Item number 3 is the minutes of the subcommittees that have been held. These have been circulated in advance. So if we could sign those off as agreed. Oh, hang on a second. Yeah.
Excuse me,
Really
Chair.
apologise.
I have a couple of comments on the minutes.
The main minutes. Yeah, I'm sorry about that. I got ahead of myself. Item 2 minutes is the approval of the main minutes of the last meeting of the Joint Standards Committee, which was held on the 23rd of September and have been circulated in advance. You had some comments you wanted to raise on those, Councillor?
Yeah, it was on page 9, which I believe is the main minutes. So around resolved 2 and the new procedures, the decision that we made at that meeting, it says that the new procedures should include the requirement that the monitoring officer should consult with the chair or vice chair of the committee prior to beginning any investigation and prior to deciding to hold a hearing about a complaint. I just wondered if that was actually comprehensive enough, because it doesn't really give any reason as to why that consultation might take place. It's just saying that the consultation will happen. Is that to inform the chair and vice chair, or is it to ask the chair and vice chair if they are in agreement with that decision? I think we did decide something in more detail at that point. I just wondered if we needed to record that as part of the minutes.
It would be my recollection, if I can here, I'm looking around for nods or shakes, that the minute is correct from what we decided, and it was in consultation, but it didn't remove the decision-making process, which remained with the monitoring officer. But it did require a consultation. I personally think that that point's been well picked up on the document that we'll be covering later on this evening, and maybe we can put in some more detail and clarity at that point. But I don't think the minute, I think it well reflects the meeting that took place. Okay. Members, any other comments on that? Is my recollection correct? Are we happy with that minute? So just for clarity, so what we decided was there would be 2 points of consultation, but we decided that that would not move the decision-making process. It would be a consultation, and that would be incorporated into the procedures and guidelines that we're talking about later on this evening. Councillor Douglas, are you okay with that?
Yeah, I'm happy with that, as long as we keep it in mind when we come to the document. And then I had another one on the main minutes, which was on the work plan. on page 910. It's 9 10s into 10. And so it talks in resolved number 2, an additional meeting of Joint Standards Committee will be scheduled for tonight, and that's where we are, to discuss 2 items, propose amendments to the terms of reference and proposed reviewed procedures. And the proposed reviewed procedures are on the agenda, the amendments to the terms of reference, so the Constitution are not. And I'm just wondering if that, what's the reasoning behind that, and if that was an omission, because I do feel it's something that is important that we understand at this point, because the Constitution is supposed to be going to full council in December.
Your point is well made. My recollection was slightly different in that we talked about those amendments now, and it was to go to audit and governance. But what I'd like to do, if I could, is ask the monitoring officer to comment on this as to whether we should be taking that this evening or where it is, please.
Chair, it's partial oversight. The amendments were made immediately after the committee and have been shared, I think, from memory with yourself. The Audit and Governance Committee has also received a copy of the amended procedures as part of its ongoing work, and the Audit and Governance Committee has determined that the Constitution will not go to full council now until March.
In light of that, could I just make a proposal which might help here? I think the minute, therefore, was correct, and there's been an oversight, and that should have come back to this meeting. But given the delay of the document going to full council in March, we should add it to the work plan and make sure that it comes back to the next meeting, which will, in light of that change, still give us time. Does that cover your point?
Yes, thank you.
So I see, therefore, that there's no further amendments, or actually there's no amendments to the minutes. There's just clarity that we had.
Sorry,
Yeah,
the full minutes, no, but I have got an adjustment to one of the hearings.
I will
minutes.
take those individually.
Yeah, okay, thank you.
So I'll sign those off technically at the end of the meeting before we leave. Item 3 then would be the minutes of the subcommittees. And the first one would be held on the 31st of August. Councillor Douglas, you chaired that meeting. Would you like to comment on those minutes?
Yeah, they're accurate.
Everybody happy that they're true and accurate? Then I will sign those off as well at the end of the meeting. The next one would be the Joint Standards Hearing Subcommittee held on the 7th of September. Councillor Carr, you chaired that meeting. Are you happy with the agenda? And anybody else who has participated, happy? No, I was at that one. I think they're true and accurate. I'll sign those off. The 30th of September, an adjournment from the 30th of August, minutes of the Joint Standards Hearing Subcommittee. Councillor Douglas, I think you chaired that one as well.
Yes, this is the one that I have a change to. On page 24, it says that the committee resolved option A be approved. That's not correct. I believe it should be option B that was approved.
We have a little challenge there because you chaired that committee. We're happy to take it as read. I can't comment on that. I was not in attendance. And both other councillors have given up.
This is the one that I think it's page 24. Is it page 24? Yes. It's here. I think this is type of butterfly error, but this one here would say B, not A. The A is that the report was not complete.
Okay. Okay, so there's a typo error on that. It should be option B that was approved. Yes, indeed. Sorry about that. And we'll sign them off with that amendment. Is there anything else?
Sorry, Chair, just to clarify, I think the confusion has arisen because page 17 is also minutes of a hearing subcommittee on the 30th of September. It's a separate matter. So
And
I
that
think that's
actually
where the
finishes on the
confusion came.
22nd, on page 22.
Page
doesn't it?
23 and 24 is the other hearing, the committee which sat on the 30th of September. So just to clarify, there's Councillor Douglas chaired page 17, the meeting that occurred on page 17. So we just need to confirm if the
If that
meeting
was-
one that took place on the 30th of September at page 17 is accurate. And we've already addressed the document at page 23, which you chaired.
Yeah,
Chair.
absolutely. But I turned both pages over at the same time. So we've got the meeting that starts on page 17 and we're happy with those minutes, are correct?
Yes, sorry.
And then the meeting that starts at page 23, which I chaired, we have a typo error, which we will amend to option B.
Yes.
Content. Everybody happy with those amendments? Thank you very much. Item 4, urgent business. I've had nothing put forward and nothing to bring forward under urgent business. So we move forward into public participation. Tonight we have one speaker, Ms. Swinburne. If you'd like to come forward.
Just on the admin of those last ones, if they actually had the reference number with the minutes for the cases, it would avoid that kind of mistake.
Yes, indeed, it was difficult to follow that, but we don't often get that number come back at once. Ms. Swinburne, you have the 3 minutes. I
Thank
know
you, Chair.
you know the routine. I actually prefer not to say where there's 30 seconds to go because I think it interrupts your ability to speak and our ability to listen.
Thank you, Chair.
So as long as you stick to the 3 minutes, then we'd love to hear what you have to say after you.
Thank you, Chair. This paper addresses several matters. I'm talking about the draft code, several matters which, subject to removing further discretions from the monitoring officer, may make some improvements, but they are insufficient. There can be no trust and confidence in this proposal when the investigations of the leader are still to be managed by the monitoring officer or his subordinates. There should be clear provision here for this committee to refer cases to external monitoring officers, particularly concerning the leader and other senior members. Chair, many amendments are needed here, mostly to constrain the delegations of the monitoring officer and thus increasing the role of this committee to ensure fair, honest and equitable process. But even that is insufficient to rebuild confidence. Considering particularly what happened with my complaint against the leader, how the conflicted monitoring officer breached all precedent and norms to bury it, considering nothing was done to see proper process done, I hope you will see how necessary it is now for you to have, as Parliament does, a matching number of lay members on this committee. It could not be the case that such a travesty of justice could have occurred with lay members on this committee. On 3 specifics, Chair, item 7, please change so that any complaint referred to an external regulator or investigation be processed by this committee and not delegated to the monitoring officer at all. This is one of the abuses of power staff exploited to bury my complaint. Item 11F, on the similar complaint issue, this is ripe for political abuse and officer favoritism. Under no circumstances can anyone but this committee be authorised to dismiss, as described, substantially similar complaints. If they are duplicate in every way, fair dues. But every citizen lodging a complaint is entitled to have it heard. Anything less is an abuse of natural justice. This, as we know, was another abuse of power the monitoring officer exploited. As written, she can again. Finally, Chair, it should be made quite clear the limited number of reasons a complaint can be dismissed. They should be listed here. The monitoring officer needs to be told to rely on one alone, not post a series of options she hopes will stick. She must publish those within a set time scale. She is silent on this. Thank you, Chair. I'll share the reports.
Thank you for your time. As the comments that you make relate to the substantive item tonight, I'm sure they'll be taken into consideration by members when debating it. Members, that concludes public participation. We move on to the substantive item then, which is a model code of conduct review of procedures. We have with us this evening representatives from our consultants, Hoey Ainscough, and ask them both to come forward and give us a brief rundown on the document that's been circulated in advance. I also note that members have received a number of other documents so that they can cross-reference them, the previous procedures, etc., so we can see where the improvements have taken place. Be interested to see what you have. You just present the report for us. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. I'll just clean my glasses. Having taken my mask off. Start to get the steam going. 2 years, yes, after 2 years of being wearing masks. Yes, thank you, Chair, and thank you, committee, for the invitation. I think most of you know us, but I will give a brief introduction just to explain who we are within context. Paul Hoey, Natalie Ainscough, Hoey Ainscough Associates Limited. To give our background, we both used to work at the National Regulator of the Standards Board for England until it was abolished in 2012, when we set ourselves up as a private company to support councils on standards issues, and we've been working ever since then, supporting councils on work like this and various other matters of particular relevance, I guess, for today's work. We were local government advisors to the Committee on Standards and Public Life when they carried out their 2019 review of the Localism Act framework, and we were commissioned last year by the Local Government Association to draw up the new model code of conduct and supporting guidance, including guidance on the case handling process, which the Local Government Association published in September of this year, and which we've used as a sort of checkpoint against which we've worked on this process. When we developed this procedure, which we've put in front of you today, we had some discussions in advance with the Joint Standards Committee to get a flavour of where some of the concerns might be with existing arrangements. We've talked to a number of individual councillors as well to get views across the councillors as to where various concerns were. Clearly, in any case handling process, you're trying to strike a balance between efficiency, so that cases don't drag on for a long time, but transparency, so that decision-making points are clear and outcomes are clear, and also accountability, so that it's clear who was responsible at any given point for making those particular decisions. It's also written as well against a background that there isn't a great deal specified within the statutory framework about what must be contained within a process. So I think the Localism Act simply says you must make arrangements, but doesn't specify what those arrangements are. I think the only statutory thing is that complaints must be in writing. I think it's the only thing that it says within the Act broadly that specifies that, and it does contain some statutory roles for the independent person. So, I mean, we're really open to discussion on the procedure in general. I just wanted to pick up one particular point though before we open it for discussion, which goes to a point that Councillor Douglas made around the role of the chair in terms of when a matter has been investigated and is looking towards getting to a hearing. We did not cover that partly because we wanted to discuss that with the committee, because we do have some concerns, and we can see some pros and cons of doing that, because it does raise issues around conflict of interest for the chair if they have made a decision that a matter is going to a hearing, and then whether they are conflicted out of the hearing panel. And it does, certainly from work we've done with other councils, there have been concerns raised where the chair has intervened at that point that it has been done. There are implications that or aspersions can be cast that it's done on a political benefit, so that the chair's party doesn't get sent to a hearing, but the opposition does, for example. So we really left that point open for discussion. We do think there might be some merit in consulting the chair where an attempt at informal resolution has been made, which hasn't succeeded, and then whether that matter is then closed or goes forward to a hearing, which we've covered in paragraph 30. And I think that might be one area we want to explore, but we're very open to hearing the views of the committee on that. But that's we haven't reflected that in that because we wanted to discuss it further in the light of views that the committee express. So those are the main points I wanted to make. I've obviously heard what Public Speaker Gwen Swinburne has said as well. I've made some comments on that, and again, those are matters entirely for the committee to consider. I should just say around the factors that we've put in, for the monitoring officer to consider when deciding whether or not to take a complaint further. We've made it clear that they're non-exclusive factors, non-exhaustive factors, that they are not, they're just things to be weighed up in the balance rather than any of them being specifically yes or no. And they are broadly the factors that the local government association has drawn up in its guidance to be considered. So I'm going to stop at that point and open up for discussion.
That's very helpful to open it up. Could I take questions from members first? So how I'd like to do this, I think, is we'll mix questions. We can go on for as long as necessary for clarity or things that you think are missing. And then we'll move on and maybe take statements and comments before we ask you to leave us, and then we'll debate any possible amendments after that. So questions for the consultants first, any members? Yes, Councillor Lucas.
Thanks, Chair. Yeah, just around how this document was put together for a start, if you wouldn't mind. So you had a meeting with the Joint Standards Committee where we put forward our viewpoints around your suggestions and good practice, best practice out there amongst local authorities for case handling procedures. And then you said to us you would go away and write a document, which I believe this is what the outcome of that is. And so I was just wondering, after that meeting that you had with the committee, who else has had the chance to have input through any route at all into this document? I include the monitoring officer or any of her staff, you as well, or any other person, and that might be councillors that are not on the Joint Standards Committee. Can you just tell us kind of what iterative process went in to get to this, please? Thank you.
Broadly, we sent a draft of this procedure to the monitoring officer and deputy monitoring officer a week or two ago, just for comment to make sure that we didn't. I think one very minor amendment was made, which was we'd put in a reference to a protocol with the North Yorkshire Police, which apparently City of York Council doesn't have. A lot of councils have a protocol with the police about how cases are handled. So we'd put, see police protocol, and I think that was taken out. But beyond that, I don't think any changes were made. It's broadly been passported through to you.
Sorry, this isn't a question for you, Paul. This is for the monitoring officer. Is that your understanding of how this document was put together, or is anybody else outside of you deputy monitoring officer and Hoey Ainscough seen or commented on this?
So I received exactly the comment that has just been described. I've made sure that Paul and Natalie have had access to all of the material, so the existing links and the existing processes and procedures. I've had no other influence. I did need to ask them about their preparedness for coming to today because I had to draft the covering report. And apart from that, I've had no further involvement in this because I wanted to ensure that Paul and Natalie had complete independence to collect everybody's views. But I do think it's right that I'm consulted just as much as anybody else. And so I would have been concerned if I'd not been consulted as the monitoring officer. I'm the custodian of this and the officer perspective. So I do think it's right that I was at least asked a question.
Thank you.
We did meet with the Joint Standards Committee, and then we met with Janie and Rachel the day after just to report back what the Joint Standards Committee had said, but we didn't, we didn't change any of the discussions that we'd had, as it were. Yes.
Okay. Anybody else? And just whilst we've got one question from myself, the member of the public expressed some concerns around 11F.
11F, yes.
So I think the main concern there is probably around the use of the word substantially, because what does that mean and how much tolerance does that give? I'd like to know your views on that.
Yeah.
And whether indeed her comments were justified.
Yeah, I mean, I'd say a couple of things about that. I mean, first of all, as I said, those are merely factors to be considered. So it wouldn't, it's not a veto, as it were, to say if it, the word substantially means that, it broadly, is it near identical? You can change one or two words and it say it's a different complaint, but it is broadly the same amount of facts. It's not just saying you've sent in exactly the same complaint again, but you've sent in broadly the same complaint, just changed, a bit of the wording. But as I say, it's not what it's saying is the monitoring officer would consider whether a substantially similar complaint has previously been considered. I think the key is that there's no new material evidence. If a complaint has already been dismissed, what is there that would cause you to change your mind? Is there any sort of new, different factors that have been added to that, as opposed to it just being a broadly repetitious complaint?
Well, thank you for that. Obviously, my concern is around that perception of that one word and how that will actually be interpreted moving forward. And maybe that's something we will debate afterwards. But thank you for your comment.
Yes.
My second question would be around involvement of the chair and the vice chair. When you put together this document, did you have sight of our last minutes, which said that our chair and vice chair wanted to be involved at some stages? And if you didn't, i.e. that's why that comment is not in your document, do you think it's appropriate to put them in?
I don't think we did have sight of it, but I think we did discuss it when we met as a joint standing. I can't remember the date now. I've lost track of the time, whether that before or after I think it was after your meeting on the 23rd of September. So we did discuss the issues that it raises around potential conflicts of interest and risks of, perception of politicization at that stage. So we really left it there. And again, when I emailed Janie and Rachel with this, I said in the covering email that was the one point that we had left that we thought the committee needed to discuss, was the role of the chair, how far they were woven in to this process or not. And we really wanted to leave that open for your discussion. And I take your point that it should say or vice chair where there's a conflict of interest, etc. But
and they're things which we can discuss later. My final question is about the conflicting of the chair and the vice chair in this. You commented on it in your preamble. Am I right in believing you were saying that that consultation at an early stage would not conflict with their participation in a hearing at the end? But the point that you're concerned with, I think you mentioned item line 30, was if the consultation took place just prior to going to hearing, there could be deemed to be some kind of predetermination within that. I think that's where you were heading.
It is, but I mean, what we advise people is that if you are consulted at the start of a process when a complaint comes in to say, here's a complaint, do you think we need to take any further action? At that stage, you are just looking at the complaint and you haven't got, the full investigation, you haven't got the witness statement, you haven't got, et cetera, et cetera. So you are just at that stage looking, do you think there is a case to answer? And I think that is very different from when there has then been a full investigation. And our concern would be if the chair is looking at it at the end of a full investigation and saying this matter needs to go to a hearing, that the chair could be perceived at that stage as having made a judgment, because that if they are then sitting on the panel, so it would, in our view, exclude the chair from then being on the panel to hear that case, because they would have at least be perceived to have made a judgment, because they would not have referred it to a hearing if they didn't think, for want of a better word, there was guilt.
So finally, just for clarity then, you're not saying that can't be inserted and can't take place. You're just expressing a concern that will mean that somebody could be excluded from that hearing.
Yes,
and therefore numbers could become an issue.
Yeah, and the second point I made, which I think there could be a concern that the chair has made a decision at that stage very on a political basis that they might want to send something to a hearing, or indeed might not want to send something to a hearing, and there could be those concerns raised as well. But our substantive point would be around the conflict of interest.
But Councillor Warping.
Thank you, Chair. Just while we've been discussing this business substantially on F, I've just been looking down on J, and this period, the section here says, is it about someone who's no longer a councillor or is seriously ill? How do we define this seriously ill? Because obviously, not that we wish ill to anybody, but obviously illness for a few months and then there's illness more long term. And how would that affect us as a committee looking at the councillor, you know, sort of on a long term basis, you know?
Yeah. I keep forgetting the microphone goes off. The first point to say, on the point of someone is no longer a councillor, we actually think that the jurisdiction ends at that stage, so you can't deal with the case. Someone who is seriously ill, and again, some of this has been dealt with through the local government association, but it is broadly somebody who is, you know, towards, you know, terminally ill, or is, you know, otherwise long-term hospitalised. You know, if they're going to be in hospital for 6 months, 9 months, having major surgery, I mean, that would be again a factor to be considered. It's not saying that matter wouldn't necessarily be proceeded with. It's just a factor to be weighed up. So you have to balance the seriousness of the allegation against those particular factors, I think. Yeah.
Thank you.
Happy with that consent. I've got Mr. Laverick next, I think. I do have other people waiting to come in. I've seen you.
Yes, I've got a general concern about paragraph 11 or 28. Oh, sorry. I've got a general concern about paragraph 11 on pages 28 and 29 about which says that all of these factors, as I seems to say, all of these factors will be considered, some of which may not have been at all. But specifically, I've got a concern about does the complaint contain sufficient evidence? I don't think that's a role that you can properly put upon a complainant. What the complaint needs to do is to say how he thinks the code has been breached, but it's then for the investigator to look for the evidence, not to expect it to be presented on a plate. And I'd expect your consultant to confirm that, given his past experience in investigating complaints.
I take that point. Would you like to?
Yeah, I think again, and I keep saying that these are just factors to be weighed up. I think what we had in mind there, and if I can give you an example, we saw, not in this council, I hasten to add, but a site of somebody who had written a 26-page letter generally complaining about council services, and in the middle of it they made a one-line throwaway, and I think the lead has breached the code of conduct, but not going into any details. Well, there was, you know, do you wade through that 26 pages to try and go back and say you've picked out this one line in here, you know, or actually if they have a substantive complaint, should they be then detailing that separately? And there is always a balance to be struck between, you know, not dismissing a complaint because a complainant maybe hasn't articulated it effectively, because, you know, some people cannot articulate those things, and that's partly why you have a complaint form. But on the other hand, not going back, you know, fishing for a complaint, as it were, saying, can you spell it out? And I think if you look at the case of Alex Salmond and the Scottish Parliamentary Commission, for example, part of the reason that complaint was thrown out by the courts was because the investigator, in that case, the investigating officer in the Scottish Parliament, did go back to the complainants and actually was accused of coaching them to articulate the complaint a bit better so that they had greater evidence to investigate. So I think it's all about allowing the monitoring officer some discretion to say, well, actually, this is just a random statement which just says, I believe the leader has breached the code of conduct, without getting into any great detail, as opposed to it being a more substantive complaint which has at least some supporting evidence behind it.
Similarly, I've got a concern about saying, well, is the complaint politically motivated? The fact that a complaint is politically motivated doesn't mean that there shouldn't be some criticism of a councillor for failing to abide by the code. So, I'm very worried about the detail of this, and
Yes, certainly.
Sorry, and say popped. Yeah.
Sorry, can I just interrupt there? What Mr. Laverick had to say is very important, and it won't have been recorded because his microphone wasn't on. So I think he needs to repeat that, please, for everybody. Thank you.
I'm advised that it cut off halfway through, so we'll be very interested to do that again. Thank you very much, Councillor Douglas. Yes, I'm afraid so, just so that it's recorded.
I'm saying I have reservations about this list of factors that it says the monitoring officer will consider. Some of them I think are factors that she or he in future should not need to consider at all. And others are, to my mind, misleading. For example, considering whether the complaint is politically motivated is, to my mind, irrelevant to the question about whether or not there has been a breach of the code, or whether it's a tit-for-tat complaint. Paragraph I, which relates to whether a complaint relates to dissatisfaction with a council decision rather than the specific conduct of an individual, is again, to my mind, irrelevant. It may well be that that's what's triggered an interest in the matter, but the question for the monitoring officer is, has the councillor complied with the code? Not whether is this really a complaint about the decision which the council itself has made.
Councillor Douglas, you wanted to add to that?
Yes, I agree with Mr. Laverick on many of those points, but I think that there are ways and means, and previously we've not had any auditing of decisions made as through the committee, and it has been suggested that that's something that we should be doing. So, for example, where decisions to not take a case forward have been made over a period of time, we should have those presented to us, and I believe so, and Howie Ainstow have also said that this is done in other areas, other local authorities, that we review those. And if the committee doesn't feel as though these have been applied appropriately, then we should be able to indicate that and give indication of how we think it should be. And I totally agree with the politically motivated, because on point D, it doesn't mean it's without warrant, does it? You know, just because something is politically motivated doesn't mean it's without warrant. And I don't think, and I would like to argue that perhaps we've been a bit too quick to dismiss things because we think they've been politically motivated. I think we need to really, you know, have checks and balances in place that allow us to assess whether that is the case or not. And I do notice that within here, there is a suggestion of reviewing cases, but I'd like, it says periodically here and there. I think we need to tighten that up. I've got points all over this document, to be honest. I could go on.
What we'll do is just to try to keep some structure. What I'll do, I will come back to you, David. I'll ask for the comments here. We'll try to keep this as questions, because when we go through the document itself, we're probably going to go paragraph by paragraph and see where we're comfortable, and that'll be more in debate, if we may, Councillor Douglas. Do you want to respond to that, those concerns about parallel?
I absolutely do, and I totally agree with what David has said about malicious, politically motivated or tit-for-tat complaints. It is the one criterion the Local Government Association insists is included in the guidance that they issued. We have grave concerns about it. I have been asked to write a paper for a monitoring officer to define what is meant by a politically motivated complaint. And I've had to say, when you're considering a complaint, you are looking at the seriousness of the allegation, not the motive behind it, and who judges what the person's motive is. That said, every council we work with has that provision in there because it has been insisted upon by members, because there is a feeling that a lot of complaints are politically motivated, malicious or tit for tat, and they should be weeded out. And that list again is there of indicative factors that the monitoring officer may weigh up. It's not to say that you automatically throw things out because they are politically motivated, but it may make you think it is something that you weigh in the balance. You know, you are less likely to investigate something if a complaint, if a complaint has been made against a member and a member immediately bangs a counter complaint against that other member. You know, there are factors to be weighed up rather than conclusive matters.
I just wanted to pick up a point that Councillor Douglas made about the committee not being sure why things haven't been taken forward. I think it would be possible to ask the monitoring officer to produce a schedule of complaints that she decided not to take forward with a one-line summary of what the reason was. That wouldn't involve the committee seeking to reopen the particular complaint, but might give rise to the kind of comments I've been making, that some of these reasons might not be might not be germane.
Okay. Valid point. Councillor Carr, sorry to keep you waiting.
That's all right. No, it's all right, Chair. Don't worry. I was just going to say on that last point, doesn't that happen already? Doesn't the monitoring officer actually produce a list of cases where you've taken, or where she has taken decisions without recourse to committee? I think that does happen. But the point I wanted to make, and I don't know whether, Chair, you want to defer my concerns until we go through this paragraph by paragraph, but it surrounds question 9, or paragraph 9, sorry, which is about communication and communication to and informing the subject member, because I think it's absolutely vital that this does not descend into some sort of secret court where the subject member is not told in a timely fashion of any complaints against him or her. Not only that they are kept informed, the subject members are kept informed of the progress of the complaint and the progress of the investigation. I think that's absolutely vital for democracy. Thank you.
Members, do we have any more questions? Would you like to add any comments at the end, and then we'll go into some kind of debate?
No, I don't think I've got anything further to add at this stage.
Well, thank you very much for your time.
Do we?
I was going to do that in debate rather than anything. Okay, I've just been corrected again. So we'll ask you to stay whilst we take it through, because as authors of the document, you would take those amendments back for any adjustments that we agree. Members, you've been circulated the document in advance. We have an opportunity to ask questions on it. You've read it and clearly from the questions understand the document in some detail, but there are some concerns. There are concerns that have come up in the questions and in the comments that have been raised already. If I take paragraph by paragraph slowly, and then if you'll indicate when you wish to make a comment. So paragraph 1, content, and paragraph 2. Sorry.
Yes, so paragraph 1, this is, I suppose, a question about that paragraph, just for confirmation. It says the allegation must be made in writing. So currently, it will only be accepted if it's on the council's form. That's not what this says. It says in writing. So are we saying that we're going to accept any form of written complaint, whether it appears on the council form or not?
I think I bring in the monitoring officer. Do you have a view on that? Because the document does say, as Councillor Douglas says, in written form.
Yes, and it says ideally by completing the complaints form. So it goes on to say that. So what we've said is we've offered some opportunity of either you do it in writing or ideally by completing the complaints form. The reason why we say that is because there's certain material within the complaints form that assists us in taking the records. But what we're saying now is we're kind of sort of slackening it slightly so that it's as long as it's a written form, but ideally with the complaints form, because if you send an email, for example, we may have to go back to you just to clarify certain issues of contact. Do you want to remain confidential? So it's not necessarily things that would come to mind if you just send us an email. So it's just about that ongoing dialogue. So we've actually offered more scope here.
Yeah.
So can I just ask for clarification then that the new procedure will not require that the only way a complaint can be accepted is if it's on the council form. It can be accepted via email.
Chair, if that's the wish of Joint Standards Committee and it's written into the procedures and it's approved by full council.
Can I just come in with my understanding from that comment there? You can make a complaint in writing by any form whatsoever, and that's the document that we've been asked to consider and put forward. I think some people, computer-wise, may well be disadvantaged if that was the only way that they could do the complaint. But because of handling and because of the collection of data, I think that should remain the preferred channel, but not the exclusive channel. Yes. Sorry.
Yeah, just to say, I mean, the Localism Act says a complaint must be made in writing. Now, again, when we've written the guidance for the Local Government Association, we have qualified that slightly to say clearly if people are, are unable to write, for example, that they are clearly disadvantaged. So, there are, the council can support them in making a complaint and doing that. But the Localism Act said it must be made in writing. But I don't think you can insist on it being on the complaints form, because if somebody sends, if somebody sends you an email with a very serious allegation, it would be churlish to go back and say, sorry, I'm not considering this because you need to fill in the form. But clearly a form is the best, is the best way of doing it, because it does allow people to actually consider which part of the code are you looking at, attach evidence. It does help to focus minds, but I don't think you could insist on it always being on a form.
I think that covers our concerns for clarity, and the paragraph, para 1 remains as it is and doesn't need amendment, and actually gives us the added ability to engage with members of the public, or then the opportunity to have other means of making a complaint if necessary. Para 2 then, if I may. I see no hands. Para 3. And para 4. I thought there might be. Councillor Douglas.
So I've underlined the sentence in the middle of that paragraph that says, if the monitoring officer is of the view that the complaint does not fundamentally relate to a code matter, then they will decline to progress it further under this procedure. And I'm just wondering there if the wording is correct. Should it be doesn't relate to a code matter, or fundamentally? That means it might not. I think potentially it's potentially a bit loose there. It has to be a code matter, doesn't it? And that's the end of that.
Can I explain what we meant by that? I think it goes broadly to a point that David was making about 11I as well, which is, does the complaint actually relate to dissatisfaction with the council decision rather than. Again, we have seen complaints where people have been unhappy with the planning decision and have made a complaint against every single member of the planning committee that they must have had a conflict of interest because they could not possibly have taken that decision. And that's actually, they are alleging a breach of the code of conduct, but fundamentally they're actually saying, we disagree with that, we want that planning decision overturned. So what we're saying is if actually the core of the complaint is more about the council policy, the council decision, and they are saying, Councillor Douglas only took that decision because of, whatever reason, then that would not be specifically a code of conduct issue. That would be more about dissatisfaction with the council decision.
Okay.
Chairman, I think it probably that sentence would be better out. The fact that the complaint is fundamentally triggered by something else, and somebody which has caused people to look at what the council is doing, seems to me to be irrelevant. It's to look at what the council has done that the code is about. And I don't think it's helpful either to the public or to the monitoring officer to have that thing in saying this isn't fundamentally about a code matter. The issue before her must be a code matter.
I agree, Chair. I think it merely repeats what was said in the preceding sentence.
So we have three members, I think, concerned about the paragraph if the monitoring officer onwards should be in there or not. I have to say I'm also of a view that it's not necessary. You have any final comments on that? Then I will propose that we remove that line from the paragraph, so it will go from breach of code through to the council, and everything in between would be removed. Content, members? Yeah. Item 5, just before we go on to item 5, because I had a comment on here of something which I think appropriately fits between 4 and 5.
Mm-hmm.
And I've suggested in my scribble that we add the monitoring officer will keep a record of all decisions, including the process followed. And I just think it kind of fits in there as an addition. It's something that Councillor Carr commented on. It is already taking place, but it becomes part of the procedure and therefore it's more formalised. Is everybody content with that being added? And we will add that section in. Mm-hmm. Paragraph 5 then, Councillor Douglas.
Yeah, I think this is a really important paragraph, and I'd like to suggest that I think that the wording needs shifting around so that the cases of when the monitoring officer, I'm not sure about the word may, I think it should refer the matter to the Joint Standards Committee to take the decision in his or her place. And so that we see what those situations might be first of all, before the actual process is explained to us, so that it's very clear that when the monitoring officer should refer it to another body, because at the moment that list is at the back end of that paragraph.
And do you have a suggestion in how you'd like to see that changed?
So I would say that the monitoring officer should refer the matter to the Joint Standards Committee to take the decision in his or her place. Sorry, I'm losing my thread now. I think what I thought was that it should be where the subject matter or complainant is a member of the executive or shadow, etc., should be moved up the list. I think really I would need to write something down for you. I've not actually prepared anything written. I just felt as though we should have a list of those situations early on in that paragraph. So it was very
clear. For
simplicity,
just 2 seconds, just my little bit, if you'll indulge me. I take your points on board. I'm not sure that the may needs to disappear. My initial views will be the monitoring officer may refer the matter to joint standards. However, in the second line, the word would should be should. So therefore that strengthens that and may defer to joint standards, circumstances where this should be done include. So it strengthens the second point, please.
I think that still gives discretion as to whether that happens or not. And I think these situations that are outlined here are so important that they should be referred, because it's about potential conflict of interest of the monitoring officer or senior members in the council having complaints brought by them or against them. And may, in my view, leaves too much discretion in there, whereas I feel this is tremendously important.
I'm conscious Councillor Cowers are coming, but I think I'd love your comments as well, please.
Yeah, I was just going to say, I think if I understand Councillor Douglas's point, I think that's probably the best way to deal with that would be to put that if the monitoring officer has a conflict of interest, they must refer the matter to the Joint Standards Committee, and then list examples of things that could lead to a conflict, but that list would not be exhaustive, because there may be things that, you know, we've not thought of here, but nevertheless could lead to a conflict for the monitoring officer. And I think that's why, when we'd written this, it was not as firmed up. It was a may, but actually, I think, you know, the point that actually, if a conflict exists, then it would always lead to it being referred to the Joint Standards Committee. The area that's up for, you know, that's not concrete would be that list of what leads to the conflict. So I think Councillor Douglas was initially talking about changing that sentence round, and that's how I would propose that was dealt with.
Councillor Capp.
Yeah, thanks, Chair. I would agree with Councillor Douglas, and I think what Mazengo is already saying. We need to strengthen that paragraph by taking out the discretionary or the discretion of the monitoring officer. And there are certain circumstances where the complaint will be referred to the JSC. Simple as that.
Yes.
I just wanted, I mean, and clearly it's entirely a matter for the committee, obviously. I just wanted to highlight a couple of other reasons why there was a discretion built in there. Two reasons, partly because you may get a complaint against, and I keep using the example of the leader of the council, that's not casting any aspersions, but it's, you know, the typical of, you know, the most high profile political complaint. There may be an allegation against the leader of the council and a backbench councillor, if you like, which is if the complaint is about the same matters to people. Are they both referred, or are they, you know, where's that discretion lie? And equally, the situation where actually it is a very technical breach. And I think the example I've used in the past is, you know, you failed to complete your register of interest within 28 days because you finished it on the 30th day. Well, it's already been dealt with. Does that really need to go to the committee to be assessed? So that's why we were trying to build in some discretion. But as I say, we're entirely in your hands. If you wanted everything to go to the committee, which dealt with, for want of a better word, senior members, that's obviously entirely within your script. And just the other point to make, when we met with you as a Joint Standards Committee, you talked about members of the executive or shadow executive. We added in committee chairs or deputies, and we, again, you know, it's entirely within your gift. And I, you know, don't quite understand how York works, or, you know, whether that includes everybody, and therefore there's nobody left. Or
I think that level of inclusiveness covered
yes.
where we were actually heading, to be honest. I also thought about people who had a paid role, special responsibility level being included as being a way of wrapping it up. But I think the chair's comments that you've put in there works for me. Sorry, David.
There's just a slight drafting point. There's a slight conflict between paragraphs 5 and 6, I think, because 5 saying what should happen in certain circumstances. 6 also says that where there's a conflict, where the monitoring officer has a conflict of interest, there's an alternative there of going to a deputy monitoring officer, whereas 5 has already committed her to put the matter to the Joint Standards Committee. So it just needs tidying up, I think that.
What we were trying to distinguish between there was in paragraph 5, where it involves senior members, where the monitoring officer has a conflict of interest, because it may, for example, be because of the advice the monitoring officer was given, or just because it involves a relative. Then the choice is either it can goes to the committee, or it can go to the deputy monitoring officer. Because I think in practice the deputy monitoring officer probably does quite a lot of assessments at certain stages anyway. So it was allowing the monitoring officer discretion, not to say every time there's a conflict of interest in term, you know, in sort of what one might call code of conduct terms, where, you know, yeah.
I'm not suggesting we do anything about it now, but I just think I'd like to have a look at those two and try and get it clearer that there are two possible routes there.
Being keen to keep moving. Go on, Cam.
Yeah, sorry, I agree that 5 and 6 are intertwined. And I also just wanted to make the point, I'm not a lawyer, so forgive me if this is incorrect, but you know, the use of may is not a legal term, but should and must are, aren't they? And I think we should be using those kind of terms so that it's very clear within here where discretion lays and where it doesn't. And on 6, what I thought could happen there, because I just don't think it would be appropriate for the monitoring officer to decide there's a conflict of interest and then we still keep it internal through the deputy monitoring officer. There will be cases where that isn't appropriate, and I think we need to have a delineation and be very clear about that. But something I thought might be able to encompass this is that 6, it could say in consultation with the chair or vice chair of joint standards committee, that the monitoring officer may also delegate the decision to the deputy monitoring officer. So that means that there's essentially committee oversight of that decision, may alleviate some of that problem, I think.
I'm going to, if I may, just break my own rule. And one of the comments I put under 8 is that strengthen the consultation with the chair and the vice chair. If it's strengthened in there, I think it would cover the point that you're trying to make about the conflict.
Yes, I agree. I've got other things further down the list, but I think every point in here where we need to make sure that the statement is as strong and clear as it needs to be, so that there's no argument about whether and who should have been consulted or delegated to at that point in time.
Okay. Other members, do they feel that we need a level of consultation? I'm just getting a little bit concerned that if we consult with the chair at every stage, then that's going to be very demanding, chair or vice chair, on time and may lead to further conflicts. Doesn't mean to say it can't be done. Any comments? Yes.
So my point then would be that if we don't have consultation in there, and that's totally at the discretion of members, that I don't think the monitoring officer should be able to delegate the decision to the deputy monitoring officer. We either have another check and balance in there, or that option for conflicts of interest isn't there, I would argue.
So just for clarity, what are we suggesting there? If the managing officer believes there is a conflict of interest, either at that point consult with the chair stroke vice chair, or defer the item outside of the authority. Okay. I can see the argument. Do you have any comments?
No comments on that, I don't think.
I think.
I mean, I pick up your point. I do have concerns that if the chair is being consulted all the time, the chair is basically becoming a full-time employee.
I think, just as a comment, I think that because it is so early in the process, the level of conflict for an ultimate hearing is quite limited. Comments that you've made yourselves. Mm-hmm. So therefore, there's probably no harm in adding that level of consultation, because it's not something that would happen on every occasion. It'll happen if there's a conflict of interest or a potential conflict of interest. Are members content with that? Does that cover your concerns? It should do. Then what I suggest is that we rewrite those para 5s and 6s, bring those points on the board. I'm looking around for comments, I'm less concerned about an order of issues, because I think they're only examples anyhow, but nevertheless the comments being made by members that should be thought about. But the main issue would be a level of consultation. If there's a deemed to be conflict of interest. And that might bring us on to something else later, which might be, are we clear in our documentation as to when a conflict of interest takes place? So that would be another.
Can I just make one more point? And this might be because, you know, I spent 20 years as a civil servant in Whitehall. I never use the word must unless it's got a statutory basis that it is a legal requirement, and I've tended to use the words such as may or shall, will, etc., rather than must. And I always think it is better to have some discretion in there. And the role of the Joint Standards Committee is, you know, the presumption is that this would happen, and that's what you hold the monitoring officer to account for when you come to audit how cases have been dealt with. But if you are putting must, it does fetter discretion quite a lot, and I certainly, you know, I do worry with using must when there's no statutory basis for doing that. But that's purely my sort of Whitehall civil servant cautiousness.
But less concerned about using that early in the process when it has less conflict. Councillor Douglas, you want to?
I think the difficulty from our perspective as a committee around the use of may for when we are dealing with people who are from a legal background, they know that that has no standing and they tell us that. So if we have should and must in our document, then that gives us more strength to say, no, this is how it's going to happen. I think it's really important.
Okay, I think we've well covered those paragraphs in question. Paragraph 7. Paragraph 8. Oh.
Sorry, I have got something in 7. Complaints which identify criminal conduct or breach of other regulations, again, may be referred to by the monitoring officer to North Yorkshire Police. Do we not have any statutory requirement to refer something when we think that there's been illegal activity? Because with the safeguarding, for example, it would be illegal not to report it.
Again, what we have in mind, and we do see some councils which say monitoring officer must refer any potentially criminal allegation to the police. Now, we get concerned that you know, if two councillors shove each other in a council meeting, that's potentially an assault. That is not a matter that should go to the police and sit in the police file for 2 years. That should be something that the monitoring officer and the council can sort out. Because actually, things that are potentially criminal offences can be quite low level, if that makes sense. So I think where we've seen councils which say any allegation of criminality must be referred to the police, that has tied people up in knots for many years, trying to deal with things which actually should just have been sorted out in the council chamber there and then, or, you know, sorted out within the groups, etc. So that's really why we put it. Again, the presumption would be a serious criminal matter absolutely goes to the police. You know, you shouldn't be sorting it out yourself. But on the other hand, there are things which, you know, all sorts of things can come under potentially a criminal offence.
I think there's a balance in there, isn't there? I think it almost comes into the point Councillor Carr made as well, which was it's only fair to the councillors involved that it's dealt with in a timely manner. And if every issue is actually deferred to the police and stops, then what pressure and duty of care do we have to the councillors in question as well? But Councillor Douglas.
Yeah, I think this is a tricky area because if there is a conflict of interest, potentially, then there can also be a conflict of interest about referring an item to the police when there's suspected criminality that's occurred. And I just think we need to get this right so that those cases that should be referred are. And I'm not sure that this wording here really allows for that.
I think if the complaint or allegation is serious enough, the complainant, him or herself, may well have referred it to the police, rather than wait for the monitoring officer or whoever else in the city council to think it should be referred to the police.
I'm concerned about not progressing something which could be quite low key just because it's been referred to the police. But
yeah, I mean, 2 points. First of all, I mean, as Councillor Carr says, that you can't stop somebody going to the police, and they're perfectly entitled to go to the police if they so wish. But secondly, this was the paragraph where we had in accordance with the protocol agreed with the police, which Rachel and Jane told me you don't have now. A lot of councils do have a protocol which says these are things that we would expect you to refer to us, but the police certainly don't want the monitoring officer referring every little sort of kerfuffle in a council chamber to them. So it might be something that you need to discuss with North Yorkshire Police, and it would probably be something that monitoring officers across North Yorkshire would discuss, because generally these tend to be sort of county-wide.
Can I make a proposal that we prepare, the term that you used, Paul, was a protocol for referral to the police, so that this is agreed with North Yorkshire Police and we have a list of potential cases where that should happen?
I think that's really valid, and that may well be. I mentioned earlier some of the conflict of interest and documents around that, and another piece of work that clarifies these areas sits alongside this document we're talking about, seems really appropriate. However, on that particular paragraph, I think there may is probably the right balance being used in the two places, because it leaves those options open at this stage.
Yeah, I would be happy with that paragraph if we had a protocol alongside it. So I think that paragraph needs to change in the sense that there is no mention of a protocol at this point in time. So I'm not willing to accept it in its current form, to be honest.
Just keen to move on. These will not come into effect until March. Does that suffice to give us a deadline to do a piece of work around it to support this document at that stage? What I'm loath to do is amend a document as an interim when we know where we're heading, and technically within the timetables, we could make that timetable. Would you be content with that?
Yeah, just thinking about all of the considerations that need to be fed into this document, I think it's a working document at this point in time, isn't it? And that it would be helpful for the changes to be made, and then it's brought back to committee again before we finally approve it, given that we now have more time to do that, as I understand.
100%, since we've now got a delay and we'll have another 3-month period. This extra meeting was required because we can progress it, but I don't believe with the amount of amendments we've got, we're going to sign this off this evening now. There's just too much in there, and we need to see that come back, and then have hopefully minor amendments thereafter, but it will give us an opportunity to get comfort around supporting documents, which is a valid concern that you've raised. So for now, because of that, we would leave paragraph 7 as it stands. Paragraph 8. Then my comment on paragraph 8 would be, okay, so I should just look over there, Councillor Douglas. My comment on paragraph 8 would be the last line. We have decided that consultation will be in consultation with the chair or the vice chair of joint standards. So it should be added to the document. Was that the point you were about to raise? Then we will add that. Paragraph 9.
Within this one, on line 1, the monitoring officer will also notify the subject member of the complaint and provide them with a written procedure. At this point in time, the subject member isn't informed as to what to expect of the complaints procedure against them. And I have had many reports that this is tremendously stressful, therefore. So I think they need to be informed of what to expect, as well as the complainant as well.
So, Chair, I would agree with that. It's also equally stressful for us when we're not given permission at this early stage to share the nature of the complaint. And part of that is a human bit. I have a duty of care to all councillors as the monitoring officer, and to tell someone that there's a complaint about them and then not be able to go into the details means that I'm worried about that councillor, because they then spend all night, all evening, all weekend. Sod's law, these happen on Fridays, and there's no access to support during the weekend. And it is very difficult, but the current procedures do not allow us, without permission, to share the details of the complaint, unless circumstances arise where an investigation is triggered, and then obviously you have to share all the details. So I would agree with Councillor Douglas on this. I think it just doesn't feel right that we can't share things, and then be able to offer the subject member of the complaint any support.
Councillor Kerr.
Thanks. What's your concern, monitoring officer, about notifying the subject member? I mean, surely you can say there's been a complaint made against that subject member. I know you can't go into detail, but you can say that there has been a complaint. You can anonymise it. I mean, clearly you're not going to divulge the complainant's identity.
So there's two elements. One is the identity of the complainant. So the complainant has a right to remain anonymous, remain confidential, not have their details shared. So that's one element. The second element is about the enormity of the detail or the breadth of the detail about the complaint. And many councillors want to know lots and lots of detail about what is alleged in the complaint.
Sure.
And we need the permission to share that. And often we don't receive the permission. Under the current procedures, we don't receive the permission. So we do want to share as much as we can, because it's a very uncomfortable position to be in.
Yeah. I just don't think it's good practice to leave members in the dark. And I think, quite honestly, we should be able to describe the complaint without giving away too much information. And we've got to do it. My other point, Chair, was we've got to do it in a timely manner. Paragraph 9 says the MO will also notify the subject member. I'd like to see a time limit put on that, you know, within so many days of receiving the complaint, for example, because I think it's too open-ended at the moment. I'd also like to see an obligation on the monitoring officer or whoever to keep the member informed, because I've been approached by a number of members who have expressed severe concerns about being kept in the dark, and I don't think that's healthy.
And it can be a very, very worrying situation. You wanted to come in, Paul.
Yeah, I mean, what we intend here and what we see as practice elsewhere is that if a complaint comes in, I mean, the first question the monitoring officer needs to ask the complainant is there any reason why your identity should be kept confidential? The presumption is generally it shouldn't be kept confidential, but there are clearly situations where, in bullying cases, for example, where the person may not want their identity disclosed at that stage. But we would normally expect the complaint itself to be shared. And the reason we've put unless there are compelling reasons, again, there are some circumstances where disclosing a complaint at that stage can, you know, contaminate the investigation, as it were. So, you know, if a councillor is accused of disclosing confidential information and is told that they have the opportunity to go away and destroy documents or what have you, or if there is potential to intimidate a witness or what have you, but the general presumption would be that the complaint is shared with the member at that stage.
Wishing to move on, as I hear it, when you're looking at the document again, we would like more comfort around the two things. One, the sharing of the complaint will be the assumption, and there has to be something in there that words it so that withholding information would be the exception. And we don't think there's enough strength in there at the moment. And Councillor Carr's point, something that makes it clear that the subject member should be advised as soon as possible and strengthen up that with some kind of limits or guidance.
And just to pick up Councillor Douglas's point that there would be some information shared with the subject member about what to expect in terms of processes as well. Is that correct?
Yeah. I think we've got to be conscious on this, that the subject members can be very concerning, you know, we will come across it and it is quite stressful. Para 10 then. Para 11. This has given quite a lot of concern, and I remind us from the previous discussion that item F was the one pointed out by the speaker. Any comments?
Chair, can I add a comment? Sure. So in previous procedures that I've operated within at other councils, I've had slightly different wording of section F to say same or similar. So I've not experienced the word substantially, but in previous councils, I've had the wording same or similar, and I've also had a time frame put on there as well, which this section has as well. So it's just my previous experiences. On
that F, I have to say I would be more comfortable with the word same. So if the same, then they're
Agreed.
naturally excluded. Everybody comfortable with that? Everybody happy with the rest of 11? Councillor Douglas?
Yeah, it's not really, well, I suppose I do have concern about some of the items that are mentioned in here, but I think it's a bit difficult to also omit them. But I really think that the auditing principle, so that committee is happy that these A to J are being applied appropriately, we're given that opportunity, because at this point in time, I don't think we are. And Councillor Carr said earlier about, you know, reporting of cases to us, and we do get reporting of cases. We get reporting of cases that weren't taken forward and where decisions were made, but there are some that we never see the light of day, that were eliminated in the very first stages. So it's everything that we need to be able to audit. Are we happy that at every stage these procedures are being applied as we intended? And the auditing option needs to fall into place, and it is mentioned in here, but
interestingly, I see that already covered in the point that we added right at the beginning under point 4 of keeping a record that showed reasons, and that kind of strengthened it within the procedure.
Yes.
That was,
yeah, I agree. And then later on, we'll come to that in a moment. At 14, it talks about
Sure.
reporting to Joint Standards Committee. It says periodically. I'm jumping ahead a bit of you now, I'm afraid, but I think that's too loose. Periodically, I think.
Let's cover it when we get to it.
Yeah, I will come back to that.
So one slight amendment to 11, and moving on 12. 13. Okay, Councillor Douglas. 14.
I'm talking about 14. Right, so it says the monitoring officer will report to the Joint Standards Committee periodically on cases, and that potentially leaves it open to not reporting on it. So I think a time frame needs to be in there. I suggest quarterly, but I'm open to other suggestions on that.
Any view?
No, I mean, we clearly meant that there should be some time frame in there, but it's just, you know, it partly depends on the number of cases. Yes, yeah.
No, Chair, so long as the timeframe that's set here falls within the scope of the committee meetings, because obviously we don't meet that often, so the timescale would have to reflect how often we meet on the corporate calendar. So for example, if you said 12 weeks, the committee doesn't actually meet within a 12-week period on occasions. So our meeting would be September, so I think it's more 16 weeks.
Yeah.
So just making sure that we don't set me up to fail with the time frame when the
Yeah.
committee doesn't meet
Yeah.
frequently enough to meet the time frame.
But effectively, it would be a standing item on the agenda, and there may not be anything to report. Yeah.
So, yeah, one way or the other. I've added under para 19, I'm breaking my own rules, that this period should not exceed 16 weeks as an addition to the end. And the reason for that was that it effectively meant it had to come back at the next meeting. But if there was a lot right just short of a meeting, it could be carried over to the next. I think that same comment should be added onto there.
Another simple way of doing it is the monitoring officer will report to the Joint Standards Committee at every meeting of the committee on cases which there has been no further action taken. So it remains a standing item of the agenda.
Can we reword it to that? And when we come back to the next point and reword that one in the same way, what we're keen to do, I think, is bring it back to the next meeting. But we are conscious, I think I'm getting some nods around the room, that should there be 4 or 5 come in a week before joint standards, it would be unreasonable to have those straight away brought forward. So there's a little bit of tolerance. And whether that's by using a weekly phrase or the next meeting or excluding or whatever, we'll leave with you at this stage. Did you want to come back on that, Natalie? No, okay. Then 14's covered. 15. Informal resolutions. And 16. And 17. Yes.
On page 30 at the top, it says, I'm going back onto page 29 to read at the bottom, insufficient or the informal resolution does not take place in a timely way, the monitoring officer will decide in consultation with an IP and chair of Joint Standards Committee whether the case should be closed. I think if we're going to close the case because the subject member is not engaging, then I think that the committee should have some role in that.
Okay, any other comments and views? So since it's closing the item and the decision is monitoring officers, what's the consultation point?
My point is that for this situation, this is when a case has dragged on. Doesn't mean that it's not serious. It's just taken a long time to come to any closure because the members are not engaging with it. And I think I would feel more comfortable if the committee were aware that that was going to happen before that decision was made. Because if it's a serious case, but it has been dragging on, then this wording allows the monitoring officer to close it because it has dragged on, not because of the severity of the case.
Any comments, any views?
Not particularly. Again, I think it's a matter for the committee whether they want the chair involved at this stage or not. But again, these would be things that you would hold the monitoring officer to account for when they report back to say this is how we dealt with these informal resolutions.
Yeah, to me, I see where Councillor Douglas is going. I'm not passionate one way or the other. I really aren't. But there is a balance between taking every decision to members at the point the decision's made when there is already a process for the feedback and reporting in the committee at the next meeting, which we've talked about. So I question the value on this one at this point, but I'm quite happy to take the views of members and Councillor.
Thanks, Chair. I may have got the wrong end of the stick here, but doesn't this put far too much responsibility on the monitoring officer? I mean, we've got a situation here. We may have a situation where the monitoring officer thinks that the complaint is trivial or irrelevant or tit for tat or whatever, and yet it may not be. And doesn't this give the monitoring officer, and I don't wish to be rude, but an escape route to not tell the committee and not involve the committee, and to say that the complainant, to say that the subject member didn't engage, so therefore no case to answer.
I think that's an interesting point. So the question really is, my view on this particular point, this is the closing and the engagement. My personal view on this is that the monitoring officer is paid as a professional to make those decisions. If we take everything away from them, then actually we're eroding that position. Now, that might be a decision that the committee decides to do, and there's nothing wrong with making that decision, but that is a committee decision to make. I personally think on this particular point, and there are others where I've added in consultation later on in the document, on this particular point, It's the monitoring officer's decision, which is accountable in the report that comes back that we've clarified in 4. David?
I just wonder whether a possible midpoint there is that the matter should be referred to the committee or to the chair if the monitoring officer and the independent person are not in agreement.
I think that's a very sensible suggestion as a midway point. Is everybody content with that? I can see both arguments, I really can. I'm just conscious that it's how much constant involvement throughout and getting that balance right. Item 18. 19 then would be the other one that I referred to that needs some wording that brings it back at the next committee meeting. And 20, the investigation. Yes, Councillor Douglas.
So on 20, where a matter is referred for investigation, the monitoring officer may carry out the investigation him herself, delegate it to another officer or contract it out to an outside body. Where a conflict of interest happens or exists, what happens then? I just feel as though we need some detail around when that contracting out will happen. I think it's a bit loose, that term at the moment.
Yeah, I mean, this to some extent is a high level process, and then we would expect probably beneath this some factors to be considered when contracting out or not. I mean, our presumption generally, and again this is reflected in the Local Government Association guidance, is that the monitoring officer wouldn't do the investigation because the monitoring officer should be keeping clean hands to be the advisor to the panel when it comes, and if they've done the investigation then they can't really advise the panel. So if the monitoring officer decides they're doing the investigation at this stage, they need to be very clear what happens if the matter comes to a panel and who deals with it. So the general presumption is that the monitoring officer would either delegate this or in exceptional circumstances contract it out to an outside body. That's not us asking for work, but that's just I wouldn't necessarily want to write on the procedures, the factors to be considered in here, but you as a committee may want to, be reassured when these things are being dealt with, not least particularly if they're contracted from an outside body, because that commits the council to expenditure. I mean, all investigations expenditure and time of internal officers, but if you're going to an outside body, you need to be clear that that isn't just, I can't be bothered doing the work, as it were. Yeah.
Chair, in practice at the moment, where I've got a concern about whether the investigation should be external, that is a decision that I do put to the assessment committee as part of consideration, because it does incur a cost, and we have got evidence of that happening. So we have had some assessment subcommittees where there's been a particular recommendation for that committee to approve external appointments of investigators because of the cost factor. And just for clarity, I do not undertake any investigations.
Okay. I think there's some valid points actually here. I'm conscious that we've already said that we need a document that clarifies conflict of interest, which actually is the point. And I don't know whether it's worth, for clarity, adding to the end of this para something on the lines of and be mindful of conflict of interest, which just focuses the mind and directs it back to another document, or whether we wish to go further and say external appointment should be discussed and kind of formulate the procedure which is informally taking place.
Yes, Chair, because I'm also mindful that if I ask an internal member of staff to undertake an investigation, they may also have a conflict. So I've also got a duty of care to my staff.
Yeah.
I have to look at history of some issues as well and the safety of those members of staff. And if they indicate to me that they refuse to undertake an investigation, I'm often left with no other option than consider external appointment for a variety of reasons, not just conflict, but for duty of care reasons as well.
Councillor Douglas.
I suppose what I am concerned about here is that I think it's really important that the monitoring officer has a very clear list of when the committee will expect that work to be contracted out, because if there is political pressure on the monitoring officer, which is a conflict of interest, to not actually contract the work out, then if it's not clear when we are going to do it, then it's very hard for the monitoring officer to say, no, I must do this, because that is what Joint Standards Committee is expecting of me. So I think this is really quite important to avoid that situation.
Any other views? Sorry, Natalie.
Can I just clarify, because it's not something we've put in here, but are you saying that when things do go externally, that decision to go external is taken by the Joint Standards Committee? Because that I wasn't aware that we haven't got on the.
There are examples at the moment where there's been cases that I've determined should come to an assessment subcommittee, and as part of that referral to the assessment subcommittee, I've also asked the committee to specifically approve the appointment of external people to undertake investigations for a variety of reasons: staff safety, conflict of interest, consistency of previous practice as well, which I think should not be overlooked. There is a need for consistent management of complaints, and where there is a historic practice of external investigation, I do think that should be considered a significant factor, so that councillor or that council is experiencing the same application of the procedure. So there is a variety of factors that I would look at.
I think the point that Councillor Douglas is trying to make is that there is clearly a procedure for almost approval to go external, but that's on the items that come forward, and we need some comfort. I think you need some comfort around which ones are requested to go external, which is a slightly different part of the process. Is that?
Yes, I'm particularly thinking about when it's a complaint that's brought against a senior member in the council, or made by a senior member in the council. I think those are the most problematic areas.
And the concern there would be internal pressure, which, whilst I honestly don't believe takes place, the public perception may well be that it does. So you're happy to do some work around that, which would
one can certainly draw up a list of factors that would be, weigh in the balance, as it were, when making that decision. The question is whether you want that decision to say, if the matter is going external, that will be done with the agreement of the chair, or whether that.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not sure that's actually the point, because I have less concerns about items going that the monitoring officer decided to go external and saying yes, it should. I have more concerns about items which don't go to the chair because they're dealt with internally when they should have gone externally. And I don't know how we overcome that concern, or whether indeed overall it needs doing. We do have a professional officer who's paid to make those decisions. I think I'm probably in the place whereby the conflict of interest document that we've got needs to clarify that position, and then in this point, it's actually the decision is made by the monitoring officer as is. Now, I know you'll be somewhat uncomfortable with that view.
No, I think if the documentation is clear and then it's reported back to it's another form of auditing, isn't it? That we get to see when these decisions are made and why, then we can say, well, we thought that one should have gone external and it didn't. Why didn't it? So I think there's ways and means around this too.
And I believe that in this situation, that would be our role to do it. So I think we've covered that well. If anybody else has any other comments. Okay, 21.
There's a typo in it.
Oh, is there?
At the end of the first line, within 3 months of the monitoring officer's decision. Sorry, is that right? I thought that.
Is my English worse than yours? But I can't see anything wrong there. 22 and 23. Yes.
Sorry, I do have something written down here that I can't remember which one it refers to. I think it's 22. The subject member is notified who the relevant IP is for the case and may seek his or her views at any stage during the investigation. I think we discussed around this that can potentially put the independent person in a tricky place, and they need to be, their safeguarding needs to be considered as well. So I thought what appeared on 23 as the second sentence saying, however, such a request will only be granted at the discretion of the IP in consultation with the MO should appear on 22 as well. Is that possible or sorry?
It's not possible because 22 is a statutory requirement.
Okay, yeah.
Yeah, but what we will do, and one of the things we've talked to officers about is also looking at they can and they should or should not talk to a subject member about potentially.
Then if we can move on, 24 and 25. 25, 26.
26, yes. Where the investigation has not been personally conducted by the MO, the final decision as to outcome will nevertheless be made by the MO unless there is a conflict of interest, in which case the decision will be taken by the deputy monitoring officer. And I thought this was another place where there needed to be another check and balance in there, in consultation with the independent person and chair of Joint Standards Committee, not just the deputy monitoring officer, because if there is a conflict of interest, we're back to square one again, aren't we, with it being dealt with internally and us not having any oversight of it.
I think your points are valid and actually tie in with the minutes of our last meeting and the consultation prior to hearing, one way or the other. However, I've put for that to be added and strengthened in point 30 somewhat later, because it's all under that section of investigation. So same point, but I just put it at a different place.
I would say again that I think this document needs to mention that those consultation points at every stage where we would expect to see it, so that it can't be argued that it didn't tell us that it needed to happen.
So where I suggested putting it in, if I may, is 28. So at the end of the investigation, the may conclude, and that prior to progressing to hearing, that would be the consultation point. I still have a view it covers both, but can I just bring in Mr. Laverick?
We have had one situation several years ago now, it shows how long I've been doing this, and it's time to stop, I repeat, where we did need to bring in an external monitoring officer because we felt that there was a need to avoid any suggestion of the council itself being prejudiced, as it were, and perhaps there should be some working in of that possibility somewhere.
Possibility as well.
Yeah, I still have concern that on 26, if our monitoring officer has been conflicted, I still don't think that the DMO should be taking the decision either, because it's not distant enough from the monitoring officer. It's too internal.
I just wanted to distinguish between 26 and 28. 26 is just saying, are you satisfied that this has been a good investigation or thorough investigation and the conclusion is reached? 28 is then talking about how that investigation is disposed of. So they are two separate points. I think you could write in here where conflict of interest is either to the deputy monitoring officer or to an external monitoring officer. Again, I wouldn't necessarily expect the chair of the Joint Standards Committee at that stage to be looking at the investigation report and saying, I want you to go away and interview 4 more witnesses before we conclude this report. Because this is really saying, has this investigation been done to a standard to which I'm happy. I wouldn't expect a monitoring officer at that stage to be sort of necessarily saying to the investigator, I disagree. You know, it's just satisfying themselves the investigation has been done properly.
Okay, so in that case then, it's, I suppose the word outcome to me is misleading.
Yeah.
I think perhaps it should say recommendation of the report or some words to that effect rather than outcome, because I think that would give clarity that we're talking about.
Yeah. What we mean by outcome, you know, has the code been breached, yes or no? Yeah.
Yeah, I think it needs to be looked at, that word, so that that's clear in that paragraph then.
And we'll strengthen that consultation. And we'll strengthen that consultation point at the 28 or the 30. So 27 runs over the page. 28 then. So at the end of the investigation, the monitoring officer may conclude, and that would be the consultation point then, following on from that discussion. So I've put, prior to progressing to hearing, the monitoring officer will consult with the chair or vice chair, but that may be because of the discussions and how they've gone. It's just at this point, a further consultation should take place with the chair or vice chair. Councillor Douglas, all right? Then 29. And 30. Sorry, Mr.
I just wonder whether in 29 there should be a reference to say there is a possibility of judicial review of that decision. So it says there's no right of appeal.
Yes, it means there's no right of internal appeal. You can judicially review this process at any stage, of course, yes, but I wouldn't want to necessarily put on the face of it to tell people if you see what I mean. But yeah.
A committee's view on that then? I mean, everybody's got a right of judicial review, and I think that does read internally, but
that goes for all council decisions, doesn't it, really?
Councillor Douglas.
The other route is through the Ombudsman, isn't it? And we have included that previously just to make it clear that the internal process is completed at that point, but there are external routes should the person want to go that way.
So could we overcome this by just changing the word into something there is no internal means of appealing against that?
Just take out the words and there is no right of appeal against that decision.
Views, members? Yeah, okay, we'd remove that. So we're not telling them there is a right, but we're not telling them there isn't a right. Did you want to come in?
Chair, just to add there,
Yeah, sure.
I think our consultants will tell us that the right of appeal, there is no right of appeal under the primary legislation, is there? Localism Act.
That's quite right. It's this balance.
Nor is there no right of appeal. Some councils do have an appeal mechanism within their process, and I think that's why we wrote in here that there is no right of appeal, because we generally tend to discourage there being an internal appeal, because this is meant to be, the Localism Act is meant to be light touch. It's meant to have very little sanctions, and if you just keep prolonging a process for years and years through various rights of appeals, and when the research we've done when there has been internal rights of appeal is that those appeals tend not to be upheld because it's been through a already fair process. but you can include an appeal if you really want to, but I would strongly discourage it internally.
Chair, if I may, personally, I would like to keep reference that there is no right of internal appeal, because it is a question that is asked all of the time, and it's about transparency. So rather than just removing there is no right of appeal, I would actually prefer it if there was some reference to that of being the internal process.
To me, that seems quite logical, that this process finishes, but we have to word it in such a way that shows that it is our process that doesn't have appeal. We don't have to mention any other progress after that. That would be for the individuals, and it might develop questions. But I think what we've got substantively is correct, and there is no right of appeal against the decision internally. I'm sure we can come up with something that just covers that off.
Yeah, I was just going to clarify that we're not going to add in anything about JR or the Ombudsman in here, but we are going to put internal. There's no right of internal.
Unless I get somebody screaming that that's how I see the reading of the room, they're uncomfortable that it implies there is nothing at all, because there is, but yeah, it is making it quite clear that our process, there is no complaint or right of appeal against. And I've got nods throughout the room for that. When do we get up to 30? Then I think that 30 is another point for consultation and the comment. So you've got already 3 lines from the bottom of 30 in consultation with the IP and chair stroke vice chair. And I think they pick up the points you were trying to make earlier on, Councillor Douglas. 31. Yeah.
I thought that it should, it says the monitoring officer will notify subject member and complainant of the date of the hearing and provide a written outline of the hearing's procedure.
Sorry, I missed that point. Can you say it again?
Yeah,
I
on
was shuffling the
31,
paper.
it says that the complainant and subject member will be informed of the date of the hearing, and I think it needs to say and provided with a written outline of the hearing procedure.
I totally agree. Yeah. I think there's a clear message in the room actually that whilst there's a formal procedure, there's a concern about duty of care against the complainant, complainee, complaining party or whatever. Yeah. 32. 33. 34. And 35. And 36. Yes, Councillor Douglas.
I'm on 37. Anybody got anything 36?
You're on 37. I couldn't think we'd get past
Sorry, I'm
36
racing.
without a comment from you, Councillor Douglas.
No.
37 then? Go on, you're
that
on.
needs to be no right of internal appeal as
Yes.
well, doesn't it?
And 38. I had a bit of a concern about 38, actually. Sorry about that. I didn't know that, it's probably a question for the monitoring officer, but given the tighter timetables and the decision notice and the fact that at the end of the hearing, we tell them the basic decision, so this is the notice, the detail behind it, whether that was a reasonable timetable for them to do that and publish it in 5 days, or whether it should be longer.
No, that is what we're currently working to.
I know it is.
So we ensure that the decision notice is confirmed by yourselves before you leave.
Yeah.
So, and then it gets published more or less immediately thereafter.
As long as they're comfortable that that's a reasonable timetable, then so am I. Go on, Councillor Douglas.
So I have a general comment or question. So the hearings procedure sits outside of this document, doesn't it? And is another thing entirely, and it's important that we have that in place as well.
I think that's probably very appropriate that we move on to that. If everybody's comfortable that we finish going through the documents, I think we spoke tonight a number of times where there are other documents which would help the interpretation and use of this. We certainly touched on quite strongly a requirement for something to do with conflict of interest. We, well, I would say that could potentially be a flow chart, which is easy to read and easy to understand. We touched on, well, no, we didn't, but I thought whilst we were going through the document that maybe a flow chart which showed this procedure and how it was dealt with may well be an easy way of portraying the document. And we talked about a number of other things. So as supporting documents, monitoring officer, what supporting documents do you think would be appropriate to sit around where we are?
Chair, I also think there's the list that you've just advised the panel of, advised the committee of. However, I would also appreciate how it aims go to review the member officer protocol, because I see that as an important part of the ethical governance framework which this committee is addressing. I'm mindful that that is a document that's included within the Constitution. Officers do have a right to submit a code of conduct complaint about a councillor, and they may seek to use the officer member protocol as part of their reasoning to support their complaint. And therefore, I think whilst we're looking at all the procedures, that should fall within the remit of this piece of work that we're doing. And again, invite Natalie and Paul to look at that in conjunction of how it sits comfortably and consistently within all of the other procedural documentation that we have. Again, that is part, the officer member protocol is required to be in the council's constitution. So there is a timely manner now available to us, given that the constitution is going to full council in March, for that also to be included and reviewed. I'm unable to find any evidence of when it was last reviewed.
Councillor Douglas.
So we discussed a police protocol, didn't we, as well?
A what?
Police protocol.
We did.
And then the other thing that currently exists within the Constitution that I think we need to review as well is the planning good practice, I think it's called at this point in time, isn't it? Yes. And so that basically speaks to members who are members of planning committees about what is expected of them, and it also therefore gives the public an indication of how members should behave in that respect as well, because there can be complaints made about decisions made on planning committees, for example.
Okay, so to me, we've got 5, but I'm not sure they all sit within your remit. But did you get the same 5? I've got.
Councillor Mike.
I've got 5. I've got officer member protocol. I've got conflict of interest, including a flow chart. I've got police referral for guidance. I've got the procedure that we've done tonight and gone through for clarity, and a flow chart to support it, and a planning protocol, which mainly I think is talking about predetermination and that type of thing. But I guess it's not something are they all within your remit?
I would just say a couple of things. I've also noted that we were going to do something around the role of the independent person job description as well, which we'll pick up. And I think the hearings process, did you mention we'll flesh out a more detailed hearings process? On the police protocol, we can certainly give, we know they exist elsewhere, and we can give you an off-the-shelf one. I think your biggest problem is getting the police to agree it, not getting your council to agree it. So we know that these things, the police, if you think local government is slow, wait until you see the police. So when you talk about having a protocol in place, I think you have to say best endeavours in effect, but we can certainly give you a model to look at that people have in place. On the planning protocol, I think you're probably best off looking at the local government association. They have very detailed planning protocol.
Chair, can I just comment on the planning protocol, because that is currently being looked at by a cross-party group of members that at the request of Audit and Governance Committee, and also in consultation with the Chief Planning Officer and the planning lawyers. So that is subject to quite a bit of work in progress at this moment in time. I'm very happy to provide an update at the next meeting, but there is a lot of work already being undertaken on that by those by Audit Committee. They've seen that as their priority and in discussion with planning.
Okay, so in light of that, where I sit at the moment, if I may, I see that because the document we've agreed, the case handling procedure this evening, is now being deferred until the meeting in spring, March, is it? Yeah, the March meeting, we do have a window of opportunity, and I'm not sure it's within, is it within our remit to appoint, isn't it? Oh, yeah, it's to appoint. Yeah. Yeah, okay.
Chair, that Harry Yane's got already appointed, so you just.
So what I'm looking to do is whether we can do a piece of work that gives us comfort to strengthen the document there around these other areas and bring it back to the January meeting, which will give us time to be able to at least get close to finished items before this is approved, which will cover your points that you were raising about concerns, Councillor Douglas.
Yeah, just on the planning protocol, I think that it should be something that the Standards Committee has oversight of, because it's about how members behave and what they do and don't do within the planning procedure, which is tremendously important for the council. And just around the documents, there's quite a lot, isn't there, that we want doing. There's a procedure also from the perspective of the subject member, which we currently don't have. Our procedure is from the perspective of a complainant. So we've said about informing the subject member what's to expect of a complaints procedure. We don't actually have a document that outlines that at this point in time. The hearings procedure needs to be done, doesn't it? And then also the documents that you've already mentioned, Councillor Rawlings.
I agree, but I think now we're getting too big a workload to bring back for January. The planning one, I think we can bring back, but it's only the work that's already being done, and we can add that to the agenda. So
Yes, I'm in a difficult position because the Audit and Governance Committee are doing work on that.
Yeah, sure.
And they're cross-party and they've commissioned the work, so it is already ongoing. And no disrespect to this committee, but Audit and Governance is the custodian of the council's constitution in its entirety, and that is the instructions that I've received from the Chair of Audit.
Yeah, I wasn't arguing that we should have control of it, but I think that it's important that we see what is happening. So, because it does form part of the complete standards documentation procedures. So when it's completed, we could have an update or some introduction to it, I would argue.
I think, Councillor Douglas, we could go before that. So the proposal would be that we add those documents to our list of requirements. We ask the consultants to bring something back to us in January, our January meeting, which gives us the opportunity to meet the timetable. We therefore add that to the forward plan, and we look to have some kind of report on the planning procedure and an update of where Audit and Governance are with it, so we're mindful of the work that's taking place. Is everybody content with that? Yes, Councillor Lucas.
Yeah, sorry, I'm absolutely content with that approach, but I'm also mindful of the fact that we didn't have on this agenda the terms of reference. So the constitutional aspects of the committee, and we had discussed, for example, around considering whether we should stipulate within the constitution that the chair of joint standards should be of a minority party and not of the administration, for example. I think it's really important that we do that. So it needs to go on the work plan for the next meeting, please.
That one doesn't switch on. There's no problem with bringing that back. We can add that to the forward plan. I would just add that I'm mindful that's been here a number of times, and it seems to be getting to a point where we do have to move forward on it. We make amendments, we send it away, we make more amendments. So I would ask, since it's coming back again, that members really give due thought to it before the meeting in January, not to conclude it quickly on the agenda, but to make sure that it's completed this time on the agenda and we don't have to bring it back again. Any other points to close with? Then that concludes tonight's agenda. Thank you very much, everybody, for the time. Thank you for keeping you. We wrapped up in about 2 hours, and good night.